Hi guys, it's finally starting to feel like I'm making some decent progress on my DIY sailboat refit. That no doubt has a lot to do with the fact that I've started building stuff instead of just sanding and removing varnish. I only have a vague idea of what I want to show you in this video. I want to prep for hooking up the fridge, but I won't actually be able to hook up the fridge until tomorrow. So yeah, I don't really know what's going to be in this video, but let's head over to Athena and we'll see what happens. I'll get back to the moisture levels in the hull a little later on in this video. For now, let's head up and take a look at what I've accomplished since the last video. But please keep in mind that if it wasn't for my pesky 9-to-5 job, I'd have gotten a lot further. Yikes! As you can see, it's a big mess down below. Perhaps you guys remember the cardboard mock-up I showed you in the second to last video. I've now replaced that cardboard with plywood, and I think it looks pretty good. I'm also almost done painting the area where the fridge will go. It still needs one more coat, but I think I can do that just before leaving the boat today. There is, however, one tiny thing keeping me from assembling the entire galley this weekend. I hope this will show up on camera. There's a lip here. Turns out, when the yard built the Warrior 38s, they tapped the bulkheads to the hull like you'd expect, and they then used some 5mm plywood to cover the tapping so that you couldn't see it. And that's fine, except for a couple of things. So I've got 3 things on my things that annoy me slightly about the way the Warrior 38 is constructed list. The first item on my list is the fact that this outer veneer trim piece of plywood was put up after the galley was assembled. Now that I've moved this piece out further towards the hull, I've got this gap that I need to deal with. I've placed an order for some 4mm plywood that I'm going to use to cover this up, and that's fine. But if only the yard had put up this outer veneer trim piece of plywood before assembling the galley, I wouldn't have to deal with this gap. You might think, but wait a minute, Mass, that's just cosmetic and it's not that big of an issue, and well, you're correct. And the second item on my list kind of falls into the same category. For whatever reason, the outer veneer trim piece of plywood on the main bulkhead is anything but flat. Now it's not rotten or anything like that, it's just like it's become delaminated from the bulkhead. You won't notice it until you run your hand over it, but still, it annoys me ever so slightly. The third and final item on my list is something I'm most definitely going to do something about. Look at the area here behind me where the fire extinguisher is mounted. Notice anything special about that? No? Well, let's take a look inside the locker. Ta-da! The chain plate for the inner forward shroud, or should I say the backing plate for the chain plate. The chain plate itself must be located behind this piece of trim plywood. As you guys might have noticed, I'm a big fan of things looking neat and tidy, but not at the cost of not being able to expect something as crucial as a chain plate. So I'll most definitely be removing that piece of trim plywood and figuring out some other solution. I was hoping I could show you guys a fully assembled galley this weekend, but that'll have to wait until that 4mm piece of plywood shows up. Let's move on to something completely different. But before we get to that, there's something else I want to get underway. It looks a little bit overexposed on the camera, but hopefully you'll be able to see that this is the shelf that the fridge is going to sit on, and that I've put on some reinforcement pieces here. And I've done that because the fridge, once it's fully loaded, is going to be quite heavy. So these pieces here are screwed and glued, and I've put on a nice little fillet. Earlier this week when I was painting this, it got really warm here inside the boat, and the 2-part epoxy primer I'm using started to thicken up on me. So the finish on this isn't really as nice as I'd like it to be. So I'm just going to knock down the high spots with some sandpaper before applying the final coat of paint. I've been using this brand of 2-part epoxy primer for years, and I really like this stuff. I know it's a little bit more expensive to buy these smaller cans. I could buy a bigger can and get more paint for my money, but I really like the convenience of just being able to mix this without having to bother with measuring and stuff like that, and this always seems to be just about the right amount of paint I need. I came across this while browsing a local chatlery. This is the spray version of that same epoxy primer, and this stuff is quite expensive for the amount of paint you get, so I most likely won't use it too often, but I figured I just had to give this a try. I had no idea this product existed, and I had no idea you could even get 2-part paint in a spray can, so this is going to be quite fun. There's some instructions here on the back, and looking at those, it looks like you need to take this red thing and jam it in here, and then shake the can to mix the 2 parts. And apparently after you've done that, you have about 10 hours of working time at 20 degrees Celsius. This looks like it's pretty straightforward. Shake, pop in the red thing, shake some more. think I'm ready to start painting. I know it's a little bit odd, but I'm quite excited to try this. Let's see what this looks like once it's cured. Now let's get back to what I wanted to show you before I realized that I better hurry up and get a coat of paint on that shelf. In case I've messed up that coat of paint, I still have time to apply another one so that I can go ahead and install the fridge tomorrow. Now what I wanted to show you are these. I've shown you them before. These are the LED lights I'll be using here aboard the boat, and I'll use them in combination with this dimmer. The goal for today is to see what the light looks like when you combine these two products, especially on camera. It would kind of suck to have lighting that doesn't look good on camera, because I do plan on shooting a lot of videos here aboard the boat. I'll see if I can find a good article online that explains the technology this dimmer uses and link that in below. This dimmer uses pulse width modulating. Although on Blue Sea's website they claim that dimmer uses a slightly different technology. A technology called pulse width modulating. Now, I have no idea how that technology works, but if that dimmer puts a curse on my boat, I'm gonna be really upset. I'm of course just kidding. I love the products from Blue Sea, and you guys are gonna see a lot more of those products when I rewire the entire boat this coming winter. Let's see if I can figure out how to hook this dimmer up to the LED light. Going by the instructions here, this looks pretty straightforward. Fair warning, I'm not gonna do this the proper way. I'm just gonna tie everything together with duct tape and chicken wire just so that I can test the light. Okay, maybe not chicken wire and duct tape, but this is just to test the light. All that's left to do now is to hook this up and see if it works. I've hooked it up straight to the battery, no fuse or anything. This is very much a case of don't do this back home. Let's see if this works. Ta-da! To the naked eye there's absolutely no flickering, but I can see on camera that when I dim the light there is some flickering. So let me just try and adjust the shutter speed here. That should take care of the flickering. I did have to bring down the shutter speed on the camera quite a lot to get rid of that flickering, and yeah, I'm not too excited about that, but I'll come back on my own tonight and do a more thorough test on the light. I noticed a cool feature on the instructions for the dimmer. Apparently if you hold the switch in the up position for 2 seconds, the light will remain on for 1 minute after you release the switch. That's a pretty cool feature. Of course, I plan on installing a switch right here in the companionway so that when I get back to the boat at night, I don't have to go crawling around in the dark down below to find the switch. Now let's move on to the next item on my to-do list. I'm sure some of you guys remember this patch I made in the last video. Well, all the other patches have already been glued and faired, but I figured I'd save this one for this video. As you can see here behind me, I've also been busy fairing or filling in a lot of the holes left behind by screws where stuff was mounted to, for instance, the bulkhead. Before mixing up epoxy to glue and fair the patch I just showed you, I want to sand those areas because some of them are bound to have tiny dimples that needs to be faired again. And I might as well just do that while I'm fairing in the patch I just showed you. I know some of you love sanding, so here we go. Well, that got quite warm, but at least it's done now. Let's get back to the patch. For adhering this in place, I'll use Epoxy and West Systems 406 adhesive filler. For mixing up small quantities of epoxy, I like to use these disposable plastic cups. For one, they're very cheap, and you can also get away with using them more than once. To get the thickened epoxy onto this lip here, I'll use a trick my mother taught me. My mother used to use this trick to get frosting onto cakes. Frosting, thickened epoxy, it's all the same. All you need is a plastic bag, preferably something that doesn't get dissolved by epoxy. Then you just scoop the epoxy into the plastic bag and just remove the very tip of the plastic bag. And there you go, no fuss, no muss. So there's no need to go out and spend money on a syringe just to get epoxy into a tight spot like that without making a big mess. Now trying to sand 406 is like trying to sand a rock. So for fairing in the patch, I'll use 410, which is a fairing filler, whereas the 406 is an adhesive filler. I'll reuse my cup from earlier. The tiny amount of 406 that's in there is not going to make a big difference. 410 has a really funny consistency to it. Look at how smooth it is. That was pretty easy. I don't think fairing the entire hull is going to be anywhere near as easy, but yeah, I guess I'll find out next summer. There's one last thing I can do today in preparation of hooking up the fridge tomorrow. And that last thing is to prep the countertop. This piece of plywood here is going to end up being my countertop. Of course, it's going to be covered in Formica, but still. I might go into a little bit more detail about my choice of plywood in an upcoming video. This is a good quality exterior grade VPP glued piece of plywood, and it's going to be just fine for what I'm using it for here. I removed this piece of the old countertop because there was some rot and delamination near the sink where water had seeped in over the years. Replacing this piece of the countertop is going to be pretty straightforward. There's only one thing I really need to make sure of, and that's that the countertop is well supported along this edge here. I was going to do that by putting in a spline, but it turns out my slot cutting bit for my router has mysteriously gone missing. Then I considered doing a scarf joint, something like this. But turns out the bit I've got for my router that could help me do that is just about 2 millimeters too short. So finally I've just decided to do a rabbet joint, like this. Once the rabbet joint has been glued, I think it's going to be strong enough to help support the new countertop. In case it isn't, or in case I mess up, I still have the option of just adding supports underneath the countertop. Now, I'd like to avoid those supports if I can, just so that I can keep the underside of the countertop flush inside the lockers. The thickness of this piece of plywood is 12 millimeters. I'll set the depth of my router to just a hair over 6 millimeters. I would love not to mess this up, so I'm just going to do a quick test on a piece of scrap. That should work. Well, the test looked good, so let's give it a whirl. I'll start with this bit here. That was fairly easy. All I need to do now is to remove the same amount of material from the new countertop. To help me make a straight cut, I'll use my fence here and simply just clamp that onto the plywood. To help keep my paranoia in check, I'm just going to run a line along this to make sure that I know if it starts slipping. Now there's just a matter of the tiny bit in here in the corner that the router couldn't get to. It's time to get old school. Okay, now for the exciting bit. I think once this has been glued, this is going to be plenty strong. Yikes! I've just noticed that I'm about to run out of both battery and storage space on my SD cards, so I better call it a day and head back to Obelix. No wonder I ran out of space. I've just done a rough edit of today's video and it's 14 minutes long, so yeah, today is going to be its own separate video. Tomorrow I'll pick up where I left off today, and that will then also be its own separate video. I'll give this video a few days just to gain some views before it gets drowned out by the next video, but yeah, look for tomorrow's video, let's say on Wednesday. Okay guys, I want to get busy editing this video and upload it tonight. So yeah, I guess that's it for this video. See you! Yukul and I hope you've enjoyed this video. For more videos like it, click subscribe. Please consider leaving a comment and a thumbs up. It really helps me a lot and I appreciate your support very much. If you're new to the channel, please check out the introduction playlist. If you want to watch every single video I've ever published, check out the playlist named All Videos. It contains every single video listed in chronological order.